1 p.m. on the East Coast here. And today we are live with Dr. Steve Ommen from the Mayo Clinic. Welcome, Steve.
Hey, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
Happy to have you here as we're all locked in, day 48 COVID for me, and I'm sure you've got a few under your belt as well.
Yes, absolutely.
I know, it's kind of crazy. But today we're going to take a few minutes and talk about a couple of things. Number one, what's going on out at the Mayo Clinic in all things COVID time. And then we'll dig in a little bit more to telemedicine, and then a nice, interesting article that was published today we'll talk about. So why don't you tell us what's going on with the Mayo and how you guys have handled the COVID situation?
Yeah, it's been interesting. We're fortunate enough that we got to learn from other centers. So because the COVID virus didn't get to the Midwest or even to our Arizona or Florida campuses as soon as it did, say, in the Northeast, we got to learn a lot of lessons from those medical centers. So we really shut things down early and aggressively. And we really have kind of truly flattened the curve. So we are not going to hit that peak where we're outstripping our hospital beds or ventilators or any of those types of things. And so we're slowly reopening the practice to patients who truly need to get diagnostic procedures or therapeutic procedures. But there's a bar, an extra review that we have to do with our leadership to make sure that we're making sure it's a patient who needs to be here. And for patients that do come, we do have a screening protocol in place for everybody, so they know it's safe for them. So all of our medical personnel are wearing masks all the time. Patients that are coming here actually get COVID testing on day one, and they don't start any of their testing until the next day. So it's usually a 48-hour between when you get your test and when you can get your first face-to-face visit with your doctor or something. But again, that's part of making sure that people who are here are safe from one another, safe from us, and that we're safe from them. So we're starting to see that ramp up. As you've alluded to and talked to other specialists with, telemedicine and tools to take care of patients where they are have really taken off. We've seen a 13-fold, or actually a 13,000% increase in the use of video visits in Mayo Clinic from the first week of February to the first week of April. So it's been a tremendous increase. And there's a number of things we've done in addition to that. People still have conditions that aren't COVID, like HCM or like diabetes or people having strokes. Those things are still happening. It's not all about COVID. We have to take care of our patients for why they seek medical care normally. But so so I work in the Center for Connected Care at Mayo Clinic, which is our telemedicine operation, and I help lead that. And we put up a self-assessment tool on our patient app and our patient portal so patients could do that branching algorithm, and that for a while was changing every 24 to 48 hours in terms of the questions that were being asked on there. For our local patients who get their primary care around our medical facilities, we actually have an online ability to put in some of their symptoms, and if they need therapies, they get a response from an APP within an hour, and they don't have to come in for that. It can be done completely asynchronously. Then we are doing, the video visits. We're doing lots of phone discussions with patients as well, trying to help triage. Does someone truly need to come because they're in a declining mode that we need to get in front of, or can they say, let's do your visit, after this settles down a bit? And so we've been trying to help our patients manage that way. Within the hospitals, we've deployed a lot of our video telemedicine equipment that we usually use to reach to other organizations, and we're actually using it in our hospital. So patients that come in that need to be in isolation can be in isolation for those care workers who don't need to be in their room. So we're using video within the hospitals to keep people, kind of video isolated as much as possible. We're using some of that equipment for patients who might come to the hospital and not have their own device with them, because since no visitors are allowed, we have tablets we're allowing those patients to use so they can connect to their family and friends outside of quarantine if they don't have their own device to use for that. So we're trying to help people stay connected to their communities as much as possible.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. Similarly, we've put a bunch of devices in about 100 nursing homes around Mayo Clinic so that we can see patients in nursing homes and decide whether they need to get the heck out of the nursing home or they need to stay the heck in the nursing home and not come to the hospital based on what they have. And, we think that's going to avoid exposing some of the highest risk patients to exposures or contain those exposures as much as possible. And so we're doing lots of visits with the nursing homes in the areas around Mayo Clinic.
That's awesome. I wish we had those services in Northern New Jersey right now.
Yeah, we're unique since we're one of only 2 major systems in this region that we can kind of have that touch. So most of the nursing home residents do interact with us in one way or another in this region.
That's fantastic. So going backwards before we go forward, this telemedicine thing isn't new to you.
No.
We've been talking about this for a long time, and I know that you've been way ahead of the curve in trying to get it to not only be integrated into healthcare, but to do it wisely and to figure out how best to do it. So you've had some time to learn about it, and now everybody else seems to think this is a new thing. What do we really need to know about where telemedicine is and where it could be going?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lisa. I think, what everyone thinks of when they hear about telemedicine is the video visits, in part because that's the closest thing to what we do normally.
Right.
That's probably in the long term not the thing that's going to get us the biggest efficiency gains in terms of interactions, care for our patients, those types of things. But it is a very comfortable way for us to be communicating like we are today, or for me to meet a new patient potentially, that we actually get to meet each other. And the other place that video is particularly helpful for is if we're going to have a nuanced conversation about something. If you think about a patient who had a biopsy done for something, having a visual where as I'm talking about the biopsy results and I see someone's forehead wrinkle or the corner of their mouth turn up or down, that gives me those secondary clues of communication that are so important in making sure that what you're saying is being received, and then you can respond to that nonverbal communication. But we're also using monitors for people. So patients who, let's take the COVID positive patients. If they are a ambulatory patient with low risk, we're actually sending them home with thermometers and pulse oximeters that upload twice a day to a nursing pool that looks at those to make sure those patients aren't declining. And we've actually had a few patients who we had to help the patient contact EMS because we saw their SATs dropping and get them to the hospital. But this way, those patients weren't all in the hospital to begin with, and we had a team watching them and looking at their data that they were just at home with their family, and we were able to act on that. For more complicated patients, we have a bigger suite of sensors that we send home with them to help do that, heart rate, blood pressure, all those types of things. So taking people that normally would be in the hospital for monitoring and allowing them to be home, obviously that has unique needs in this social distancing quarantine time period. But
right.
Long term, that's a way that people can actually be at home and still know that they are being evaluated and watched over by their care team to make sure they're not deteriorating. I often use the analogy, it's kind of like lane drift detection in your car. If I can sense that you're starting to go to the left a little bit, if I can just nudge you a little bit, that's better than waiting for you to go all the way off the road and end up in the hospital. And we'll see those sensor technologies blossom after this public health emergency, because all the companies are really aggressive, trying to, learn, study the results, try to prove the value. And I think we're going to see that in the coming months.
I can see some potential studies coming up with HCM patients. How do we best monitor at home? When do you go to the emergency room or the hospital for whatever your symptoms might be?
Right.
I think there's so much potential here, and we've seen it for a long time. And I think the world has just kind of gotten a little hand in the back to push them into this reality. So in terms of reimbursement for telemedicine, where do you think we're going with that? And that really does matter to patients, because if the insurance companies aren't paying, it's not going to be offered. So where are we with payment?
Yeah, well, so right now during the public health emergency, everything's being reimbursed. So a video visit and a phone call are actually being reimbursed by commercial payers as if you were in the office. So if we just document based on time, you pay minute for minute for about the same thing. the remote monitoring has reimbursement codes that both CMS and commercial insurers are covering right now, because they all are recognizing it's better for them to help their patients get care in place and not have to travel for it. The big questions come, down the road once the public health emergency is over. What will the regulatory bodies and the payers do in terms of putting these things back in place? Will they do it? Will they do it partially? Will they do it gradually? Will it be a sudden change? It's hard to know. Our CEO has been in some meetings at the White House and those kind of things, and I've asked him what he's heard, and he said he's heard basically, don't ask that question yet. Just be happy you've got it for now. So everyone's trying to deal with the crisis at the moment. I would say, so we've had an ability at Mayo for a number of years that we've been following patients post-operatively with video visits, rather than having some patients come back hundreds of miles for a post-op visit. And we did make that, well, for surgical patients, it's often covered under a global 90-day period. So it's already part of what's covered by the insurance plans, but we've offered that in some medical areas as well, and made it a self-pay option for patients. But we help the patient understand whether that's more or less expensive than a face-to-face visit for them. And usually between travel and time away from school or work, it saves them money to pay for 15-minute or 30-minute video appointment with their doctor versus, airline travel and those types of things. So it can work out in the patient's favor to do it that way. And it's, again, much more convenient. You don't have to stop your life in order to go to the HCM center in order to get care. You can still get care from home that way. And I sure hope that the government and the payers recognize that long term, because we're all going to demand to get our care that way in the future.
In some cases, it just makes so much more sense, specifically with, the flu or something basic like that. Why go out and spread it? Haven't we learned enough?
Right.
So to have those telemedicine options are great. But as we are in the HCM space, we have many people who travel very long distances to have 15 or 20 minutes of your time and knowledge.
Yep.
And that is not just the cost of the visit. There's all of those other costs that you mentioned earlier, the train, the automobile, the hotel, the food on the road, the daycare for the kids, and all of that stuff. So if we are able to really combine in the best of both worlds, I think it's going to be a big advantage to the HCM community. My concern is always with the quality of imaging at the local level versus they get with you and any center of excellence. So I do hope that people continue to get their evaluations and their testing done at their centers of excellence, but those follow-up visits and those opportunities to titrate meds are here.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Lisa. I do think that the Echo Lab Accreditation that was put in place a number of years ago has raised the bar on echocardiography specifically. So, there was a time when I first started practice 20 years ago where, sometimes the imaging really didn't allow us to make decisions. And now, most of the time, the echo they've had locally does give me most of the information I need. And so I think that we need, as providers, to learn how to review what they've had and not just automatically order something that you might have just had 6 weeks ago, because then sometimes you end up as the patient paying for that twice repeat study. And so we're going to have to figure out ways that we can do a quick assessment on the imaging that's already been done to make sure if it needs to be repeated or not, essentially. And that's going to be a workflow change for the medical institutions, but I think it's a necessary one.
I agree. And I would say I'm not as optimistic about the echo quality. I still get reports that just say mild hypertrophy, possible hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, no numbers, no statistics, no anything. And I wonder, what did you just pay for? So we need to do a little bit better on encouraging.
From my point of view, I have to look at the images to know whether the quality is good. Looking at the report isn't sufficient for me to make decisions, for my patients. So I need to look at it and assess the quality myself. And the same for the MRIs. But it's somehow making sure patients get adequate testing and then can use that testing with their HCM expert is really going to be important.
I agree. And I think we're getting somewhere.
Yep.
And then we have like things like Zio patches, which can be sent home for monitoring, and different type of event monitors that can be sent home and hooked up and then sent right on back to you. So I think we're heading towards a new day. I'm cautiously optimistic that we're getting there. And the other piece that I think is really beneficial to patients is to have that opportunity to get that second opinion before having that myectomy done at home. Let's hear what the Mayo has to say about it. And are we able to do consults for myectomies right now?
Yep.
Yeah. Telemedicine?
Yeah, absolutely. Wait, so I don't mind doing the visit by telemedicine, so someone can know whether they need to have an operation before they make any travel plans. There are a couple of patients who I've had a quick phone call with, and it's clear that's what they need, and we've just arranged for them to come in and get that done in the next couple of weeks. But we definitely are able to see patients and able to see patients remotely before they make this decision to travel hundreds of miles potentially to Mayo Clinic for that operation. But absolutely, we're willing to do what's best for those patients and make sure that the patients who are coming, as I said, are the ones who, one, are going to benefit, and two, are at risk if we don't do something soon. So
right now, through all things COVID, myectomies were put on the back burner for a little while. And I understand that you're going to start those up again in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, well, so we've done a couple each week over the last several weeks, even. So we've been doing them again for some of these patients who were highly symptomatic and had highly complicated care otherwise, and it just made sense to move them forward. And they went through all this screening protocol, et cetera. But we've been doing a few.
Okay. And when do they know when things are going to get back to normal at this point at Mayo?
So the hope is to have the outpatient practice kind of operating at 50% of normal by Monday.
Okay.
75% of normal, by the end of May, and to ramp up from there. So
we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Thank God.
The light at the end of the tunnel. And again, and I've had a couple of discussions with patients. Our next steps will be predicated on the status of lockdown in their state versus where your HCM center is. So sometimes maybe it does make sense for you to get your next test if we're waiting for something locally, if your state opens up before my state opens up, and then I'll use that to make decisions for you. But it's going to be an interesting negotiation's the wrong term, but each patient is going to be, again, unique in HCM because each community is so different in the way this condition is affecting the community at large. Yeah,
in the Northeast, we're probably about the worst in the country at this point. Still, I can see the New York City skyline in the distance. That's about as close as I'm going to get for a while. Thank you very much. But I don't think that I'll be flying anytime soon. And we just saw a news alert from JetBlue. When they open up, everybody will be wearing masks. So the transplant patient here who always flies with a mask will fit in more.
You'll just blend in with everybody.
Just blend in with everybody. Nobody will be looking at me strange anymore, but hey, it's okay. We did have a question here. What is the approximate number of myectomies and alcohol septal ablations performed annually at the Mayo Clinic? You want to give us some general stats? Won't hold you to death.
Yeah, so we typically do probably 200, 250 myectomies a year at Mayo Clinic. And we do about 5 to 1 myectomies to ablations. So, it's probably 50 or so ablations we would do in a year.
Okay. That answered that question. But I'm going to pivot and I'm going to talk about this news alert that just came out yesterday. That is COVID HCM kind of related. And I will start the conversation by saying this is not panic zone. This is just some interesting information. Why don't you tell us what your team has uncovered about COVID and ACE2 and all that fun stuff?
Yeah, so you've probably read news stories or heard stuff about should patients with COVID continue on their angiotensin receptor blockers or ACE inhibitors because there seems to be some way the virus impacts the the ACE proteins and the protective proteins around that. And we had done a study on patients who had had myectomy here, the tissue that we had from their hearts. And we had looked years ago at the proteins that are expressed in that. And in those patients who had obstructive HCM that required an operation, there was a higher level of the ACE2 protein in that tissue compared to what is reported as normal. And so that just gives us, a question of, is this why patients with heart disease in general might be more susceptible to complications from the COVID virus?
Right.
We're using data in HCM. We don't know if that data would be expressed in patients who have long-term hypertension that isn't well treated, because we don't have biopsies on their hearts, or we don't have a lot of muscle from aortic stenosis patients who might have had a valve replacement. But it's an insight to the fact that maybe this change in expression for someone who is symptomatic with heart disease, it might be through that protein that COVID seems to be attacking that makes cardiac patients slightly more susceptible.
So as we move forward, COVID's not going away at the end of May. It's going to probably be with us for a long time, unfortunately. And while things may open up and kind of get back to normal, cardiac patients are still cardiac patients. COVID is still out there. So we're talking that these people should be a bit more cautious going out in the world and keep those good social distancing practices up. Is that really?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that, if we're talking, the community we're talking to now, the patients with HCM and families with HCM, I don't think every HCM patient is high risk, but you shouldn't ignore the recommendations for social distancing. You shouldn't be the one who's hosting the block party. You should be following those rules. You should be washing your hands. You should be wearing a mask, just in case, because you do have an underlying condition. I think that the high-risk patients with HCM are those who are highly symptomatic or have highly complicated coexisting conditions. So if you're having lots of heart failure symptoms, lots of shortness of breath, or you have lots of atrial fibrillation that comes and goes, that person is probably a lot more susceptible to complications from COVID than someone who happens to know they're positive because of family screening and they're otherwise completely active and completely asymptomatic. That patient probably isn't particularly at risk compared to the other one. So it's doubling down on the common sense. And if you do have symptoms, then talk to your HCM specialist and see if they need to help you with your employment or whatever, declaring yourself as a high-risk individual that ought to be teleworking or whatever. Most of us are doing that now anyway.
That's a great point. As we move through this and businesses open back up, I do believe that employers are going to be a little bit more willing to work with employees who are at high risk of complications. So I would encourage everybody to ask for those work from home opportunities as much as possible, or create reasonable accommodations as afforded to you under the Americans with Disabilities Act to keep yourself safe during, it's probably going to be another 12 months of higher risk from COVID until the vaccine's out.
Yeah, it's going to be a while. This isn't just a summer thing. We're going to, when restaurants reopen, they're probably going to reopen with half the seating they usually did. Right. Other businesses are going to have, the chalk marks on the floor at the checkout lanes are going to stay there for a long time. So we just need to make that the way we expect things to be and not think that we're going to rush right back and everything's going to be normal in August, for instance. It's just not going to play out that way.
No, I think we just need to be cautious and patient. I suspect our vacation or conference up in Boston is probably going to be postponed as well in October.
Yeah.
So we're going to just kind of wait things out and do things more virtually for a while.
Yeah, we've canceled all of our on-site CME meetings at Mayo Clinic through the end of this year, just so that people aren't trying to congregate in groups of 200 to 300 people for medical education. And like you say, we're going to try to do some things by, streaming, some on-demand education so that people can still get their education needs met, but we're canceling our live events essentially for 2020.
Yeah, we're about to launch online Zoom support groups. We're just nailing that down. We're going to be reaching out to you soon to do virtual regional meetings and bring everybody in for that education that we also desperately need, and we need to spread the word. But we're not going to do that in the same room for a while. We'll all be from our own little vantage points and still sharing that information. So we're looking forward to working with your team on some programming coming up, maybe for the fall, and we'll continue educating people and keeping the community, together and moving forward, even when the world seems to be moving a heck of a lot slower.
Yeah.
We have a few more minutes. If anybody has any general questions, I'm going to go through some of the questions that have been posted while we're chatting. We got lots of highs.
One of the silver linings from this has been, I actually have a neighborhood that has families in it, and you didn't know that until everyone was quarantined at home. You see, there's so many more dogs than I thought existed here, and so many more kids in my neighborhood because they're all out playing in their front yard now rather than going to the athletic fields or whatever. So it's interesting that in our neighborhood, it's actually more of a community that we wave and we see each other every day. So it's so reinvigorating local neighborhoods may be one of the silver linings from having to change our lives like this.
I couldn't agree more. You're waving to your neighbors. You actually see who lives in that house around the corner that you always saw the car. I personally have become a bird watcher.
Oh, there you go.
This is hysterical. I now know the community of birds that live in my yard. We have 2 cardinal families, 2 titmouse families, 2 woodpeckers, and we had an eastern woodpecker the other day, a big guy, and a peregrine falcon that I didn't know were native to our area. So I've seen birds that I've never seen before, and I've lived here my whole life, basically. So birds, animals, Yogi Bear visited the other day. We have a question about EPs.
Yeah.
And this is somebody that might be known to you. Is it important for HCM patients to receive EP care at their center of excellence? Or should they be doing that at home? Or could they be?
That's a great question. I think there are a lot of things that could be done at the local cardiologist, but if there are nuanced things that are specific about HCM, so when you're having that discussion about sudden cardiac death risk and those types of things, that's probably a conversation you want with someone who's really, really familiar with HCM, because there are a lot of nuances in the risk stratification and those kind of things. It isn't just a yes/no decision if something is present or absent. And so that's a long discussion. When it comes to following an implanted defibrillator, well, that's something that every medical center can do, and getting it done as locally as possible makes your life easier than if your data is going off to your COE and your other cardiologist isn't getting it and something shows up there. So there are a lot of things that can be done, and things like atrial fibrillation. I mean, most cardiologists treat atrial fibrillation every single day. And so if it's straightforward atrial fibrillation that someone is experiencing it, most of that care can also be done more locally. But if it gets complicated, then that's when you want to get your expert involved. With it's a team. The Center of Excellence cardiologist and your local cardiologist and you make up a team together, and that team needs to work together for all of these situations.
And I think that's a really critical thing to bring up, and we'll take the opportunity to do so. Center of Excellence, we've been working with the guys over at Mayo and a lot of the other programs for over 20 years. Mm-hmm. They have the knowledge and the skills and the ability to look at the whole picture of HCM. Yeah. Your local doc is critically important to this relationship as well. If you're home and you become ill, that's the doctor that's going to see you. You want that great communication. And that's the beauty of a center of excellence when they're really working well, is that there's a communication to the local cardiologist, to you. You're all a team. Yeah. Mayo's been awesome at that for many, many years to create that team environment. So I would agree with you on the AFib issues if things are getting complicated and it's to ablation or not to ablation, or what are we doing? Yeah. That's the center of excellence conversation to me. But managing your Coumadin levels from home, that's a home thing. You got to think it through. We have a question from Mike. Do you have any suggestions on how to explain to local clinicians how to assess those with HCM? For example, should we go to the ER with a low respiration rate or pulse ox, other than age-matched individuals? Interesting question, Mike.
It's a good question. So first of all, I'll just address if it's now and you're having respiratory symptoms or those type of changes, you don't want to just go to the emergency room. You want to make sure whatever your local community hospital is doing, if it's a call to see if they want you to come in or not, you need to do that just again for the COVID exposure issues. So right now it's definitely a call in situation. Now, longer term, if we get outside the public health emergency, how to have local clinicians assess you if you're having symptoms. It's a great question. Obviously, if you show up in an emergency room and you're having shortness of breath or your oxygen level's a little low, the emergency room physicians are going to screen you for all the dangerous things. And in particular, then if you also tell them, and by the way, I have hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, then that's going to tell them that I'll screen for the dangerous things like pulmonary embolus or heart attack or pneumonia or those type of things, which they need to do. That's their job. And then they know where to go next if those things all come back negative, and that is get the cardiology team activated in your care as well.
I think having a game plan in advance and having these conversations with your center of excellence is really smart.
That's a great idea, Lisa.
If somebody has chest pain that's new to them, this is concerning and you should take action accordingly. If you've had chest pain like you normally do for 3 days and it's just not going away, maybe that's a different type of situation. So to have a game plan and think these things through before they happen, you're probably better off.
Yep.
We have a couple of interesting questions here. So some of them are related, and I'm going to tie them into one big question. Mm-hmm. What do you do with essential workers, grocery store workers, registration in an ER, a nurse in an ER? Any special recommendations to them during these times?
So if they have HCM or just in general?
HCM,
yeah. So I think those high-risk occupations, like you say, healthcare worker, grocery store worker, that's one where you really have to critically review, is there something in that job you can do remotely if you have HCM? Because you really are, the chance of exposure is so high. So, now, at some point, 60 or 70% of us will be exposed to COVID and get over it, and that's when we'll get herd immunity from this. So you just need to see. If I was a patient with HCM, I'd be asking my employer, is there an option for me to be employed but not be exposed to so many people?
Yeah, we've been dealing with that for 6 weeks now, and some of them answers just no, and they're taking the risks. I can say that we have had a handful of HCMA members develop COVID. So far in the United States, none of the ones that we've known have actually had to go to the hospital. They've managed it at home. We've had 3 here in New Jersey. Mm-hmm. We interviewed one in our private group a couple weeks ago. She's recovered from COVID. She's doing well. You just have to stay on top of it and be in communication with your healthcare professionals on a regular basis so that they can help monitor when and if you might need to go into the emergency room or to the hospital.
Yeah.
So just be careful. There's no good answer. The answer is there's no good answer. Are there alternative therapies on the horizon? IRE ablation, other forms of?
Yeah, I think the alternative therapy, which is getting the most attention, is the drug therapies that are in drug trials right now, where the preliminary trials have shown tremendous symptomatic benefit for patients with obstructive HCM, and they're really now in that phase where they're trying to have enough patients in the trial to make sure there's safety in taking those drugs as well. So I think that everyone in the HCM community is hopeful that we'll have something short of getting an operation or an invasive procedure. And if a medication proves effective and safe, then that's going to be a great benefit to a lot of patients. So fingers are crossed that shows all moves the right direction.
And I will take this opportunity to pitch June 26th. Will be our patient-focused drug development meeting, where you, the patients, can speak directly to the FDA and tell them what it's like to have HCM and what your hopes are for therapies in the future. You can sign up now at 4hcm.org and join us live wherever you are. It's going to be a fully virtual meeting, which is creating a little bit of stress for me and my staff, but we're going to make it work. We're going to make it work. Good. So I have an interesting comment here from one of my favorite pediatric cardiologists who is up in New York State. Unfortunately, my scroll stopped working and I don't know why, so I'll read the rest. can we use this opportunity, pause in the world due to COVID, to help our HCM patients work on mental health, getting fresh air, starting gentle yoga, taking up a hobby, meditating? Are there other things you would recommend to HCM patients for their whole well-being during this time?
You know, that's a really great comment. We all need it. I mean, you're reading stuff about Zoom fatigue and quarantine claustrophobia that we're all having now from being stuck in our houses. And there's a bunch of things we need to do. Those examples there, going for walks, just to get outside and notice birds. I mean, Lisa's taking up a new hobby. She's being mindful by watching the birds as a way to deal with the stress of being in one building. I think the other thing that's super important in terms of all of our mental health during this time period that we're working at home is making sure you set boundaries around what is work and what is home.
For you? Huh? How's that working out for you?
It's doing okay. The fact that I run that telemedicine operation means that I was working double-digit hours 7 days a week there for a while. But now that we're kind of more stabilized on that, there's a time in the day where I shut down my computer. I'm not just going to check my email because I'm in the same building, so it'd be easy just to leave it on and hear it ding or alert and those kind of things. And it's important for your own mental health. It's important for your relationships with your family that you now declare we're going to have dinner, or the rest of the night is family time and not work time. It's important to try to set those boundaries because it's so easy to blur them when your home and your office are the same thing. I mean, Lisa, you've lived a life of variously working from home for a long time. You probably have a lot of tips for people in that regard.
Yeah, I learned first when I went for my transplant and I was shut in for 6 months. My world got very, very small. But silly little things like having a workplace and a rest place. Don't ever work in your rest place. Yeah. I can't sit on my couch and work. It just doesn't work. So it's either the dining room table or here at the computer. Those are my workplaces. And you get up every day and you get dressed and you do your hair and your makeup, even though you're the only one that's going to see you because that's your normal. Although I would think it'd be a bit odd if some of you putting makeup on, but whatever. So you make your own choices and you just try to be as normal as possible. I do love the getting out for walks. You know, at least you get to wave at a neighbor when you walk by. When this is all over, maybe you can sit down and have a drink with them or invite them over for a talk. But for right now, you just do a lot of waving and getting to know the dogs in the neighborhood too. My dog has met many new dogs.
I also think, and this is not new advice, but having the ability to stand while you're working, having a standing desk or a space where you can stand while you're doing some of your work, and a space where you sit down because you can't stand for 12 hours a day. I mean, no one position maintained for a long time is healthy for your back and your bones, but having an ability to change your body position is also a super helpful thing that keeps you more refreshed. And hydration is important. When you're locked into your home office, and again, particularly for those of you who might have outflow tract obstruction, staying hydrated is a part of being healthy. It also helps suppress some of those, the temptation of having snacks that are just a few feet away. Hydration sometimes helps you suppress that urge for those types of snacks. So it helps you keep off the COVID-15.
Yeah, I think COVID-19 might be more accurate in some cases, but the one thing that we've done here is I make my own trail mix and I put walnuts and almonds and a couple craisins, and I do put in a handful of chocolate chips, so I get a little chocolate here and there. But you find something that's not so salty and fat laden and just something a bit more natural, which is helpful. Okay, we have another one coming here from Christy. She's also in Minnesota. She's seen you guys. You've seen you guys much about the growth that's happening in my septum after a myectomy, but on the right side instead of the left side. Oh, yes, I remember this one, Christy. So let's just talk about things that can happen post-myectomy where you might see some geometry changes in the ventricle. What happens? Yeah,
so we in general, one thing you learn with medical conditions is never use never or always. But in general, we don't see that much growth after someone has had a myectomy. With the most glaring exception is if it's a child who has an operation, and then they just naturally grow, and the myectomy that was done was not adequate to account for that. It's also possible that if someone has hypertension or they develop aortic valve disease that causes more pressure that the heart has to pump again, you can see some thickness there. But as Lisa alludes to, sometimes as our spinal curvature changes, it changes the angle of the aorta in the heart, and it kind of can push that basal septum more into the ventricle again. The case of the right-sided growth, I mean, I think that can also be a geometric change. Sometimes that's really hard to see on echocardiograms, and it can be overlooked if people aren't specifically looking for it, and so it might not have been commented on and was there before in some cases. And I know that, and this is to the point earlier about echo, people always come in and ask me about what, how thick their septum measures this time, and gosh, that's different than what my team got at home. And remember, this is not just a uniform thickness piece of muscle. It's a complicated geometry, and if you change the angle of the echo by 1 degree, that can change the thickness by a couple of millimeters. And so if it's in the same ballpark, I'm happy with that, and that doesn't represent some sort of gross escalation of someone's current status.
And right-sided obstruction is a known potential. It's rare.
It happens more in kids than it does in adults, but it is a known thing that can happen.
And maybe it was just not appreciated earlier, or
right, possibly
changed and shifted it. Yeah. Somebody wants to know when the serology testing might be coming out, and being that you're at Mayo Clinic and we're hearing they're working on this stuff, maybe have some inside track or not.
We do have serologic testing available at Mayo Clinic now. It's not widely available to the world. We're having the same issue that every place is, and that is, who do you test? And we don't have the ability to test everyone. That would be awesome if we could do that. But we do have serologic testing available here.
Okay, that's good. Do you think that's where we're headed in terms of mass testing?
I think at some point we're going to need to know, because the asymptomatic positive patients are really what's going to get us back in trouble as we reopen our states and our businesses and those kind of things. Anyone who's been sick is going to know I've been sick and don't be around me. But those people who, for whatever reason, contract COVID-19 but don't get any symptoms from it are the people that the grocery store is wide open, or the restaurants, and we're all having happy hours after work. That's where we're going to see another bump in cases in the fall if we don't manage that appropriately. So I think that we'll see continued efforts at increasing ability to test.
I miss happy hours. We were having a happy hour on Fridays with my moderator groups. So we have a question. I'm going to rephrase a bit. So we all know, or those of us in the know that the guidelines are being updated, and yours truly here, Dr. Ommen, is leading the effort. I do understand that he's wearing something called heart handcuffs. So if he's not allowed to, they will take him to heart jail because he's embargoed. Yep. But what can you tell us about the process and what's happening?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we do expect the guideline to come out in November. So we're excited for that. It's been a team of HCM experts that have gotten together over just over a year now to talk about various aspects of care. It does include a patient as part of that writing committee, so that we have someone who tell us when we get too doctor speaky and aren't telling things that make sense for a patient. We got some advice. Lisa gave us some of her thoughts on what she would like to have seen improved from 2011 to 2020. So, we've taken that into consideration as well. The process generally is we assign different sections to different authors. They usually work together in teams, and then we discuss them over a series of a couple of phone calls. Then there's something called a consensus conference, where every recommendation has to reach consensus before it can move forward. And so that happened last fall. And since that time, it's been mostly wordsmithing and writing the document, et cetera. And it's has to go through a vigorous peer review process. So there'll be several dozen peer reviewers. For those of you who don't know, normally when we publish a study in a journal, it goes to anywhere from 2 to 4 reviewers. That's the peer review process to make sure we're not saying something crazy or that the science doesn't look wonky and those kind of things. And for the guideline, though, it goes to several dozen peer reviewers to look at it. So it's a very rigorous process, and that's probably what I'll be doing most of the summer, is responding to those comments.
Well, that sounds like an interesting summer. The one thing I want to bring up, and I know there's a couple of questions out there about this when it comes to the guidelines. Guidelines are based on 2 things in HCM: any published literature that has been peer reviewed and that has been accepted into the mainstay, and consensus on high volume treatment operators who see a lot of HCM and know how to nuance the written science with the good clinical practice. Now, I know that there are a few people who have issues with particular lines in a guidance document because it doesn't meet their personal experience. But numerators and denominators are really important in guidelines. And can you talk about how you come to consensus on controversial options, like risk assessment for cardiac arrest and choosing what to add and not? In theory, not in detail.
Yeah,
I know.
Understood. Thanks, Lisa. So yeah, it's a really good point. So when you talk about something, a guideline around management of cholesterol, for instance, well, there are millions of people in all kinds of randomized controlled trials where there is hard data that says treatment A is better than treatment B, and there's pros and cons to that. They have to sort through way more studies to come to their conclusions. HCM, because it's such a small community, we don't have these randomized trials, so it does hinge a lot on the centers of excellence publishing their experiences or coming together as consortiums of centers to publish, things that can help us draw a conclusion. And then we have a lot of conversations. Dr. X may say, well, I think that the treatment ought to be this. And Dr. Y might say, well, why do you say that? I've seen this. And what's interesting, and I found it during this writing panel, but also in other discussions, that when you actually get the people in the room together or on the phone together talking about it, consensus actually happens way easier than we think. When people are writing editorials or giving talks at different venues, it sounds like there's a larger divide than there actually is when you get the people actually talking to one another. So it's just to me, it's one of those life lessons that if something doesn't make sense, it means you don't have all the information. If you talk to the other person that's involved, you usually will find common ground and common information, and you can move forward with that. So,
and I would bet that when this comes out as well, we're going to find, some other little spaces that are missed. And that's why you do these things every, 8 to 10 years. And
they're actually changing the process. So it's going to be a much more rapid update cycle after this. So it's not going to have to be a 10-year cycle. So if there's a study that comes out, let's say in August, and it's going to be it's already going to be at the presses by August. Well, maybe there's an update from a year from now that changes recommendations that were based on a study. So the guidelines group is really looking to make these living documents and not tomes that are published once a decade.
That will be a welcome change. I've wished for that for a long time. I know shortly after the last guidelines were published, we started to understand more about LGE and the role of MRI, and it got lost for a while because it missed that deadline. And now we're back. So I am happy about that. I am happy about the day back in 2007 when I grabbed Nish and Bono walking down the hall of ACC and said, if you can do valve guidelines, you can do HCM guidelines. So it's a blessing and a curse when you get what you want, because it's a process that's kind of long and detailed, but it's so important, and it's helped HCM care around the country and around the world. So that's great. We've been at this for 50 minutes, so I'm going to let you wrap up here and let you get on with the rest of your day. I know there's a couple other questions pending, but they're very, very specific. So I'm going to ask you to call the office directly or contact Mayo directly with the very specific questions about your care. But I would like to thank Dr. Ommen for taking the time to join us today. This is a lot of fun. So thanks for being here. stay safe in Minnesota during all things COVID, and we'll report back from the front lines if we have updates.
Absolutely. All of you stay healthy, be safe, and take a mental health break, as was suggested earlier. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot.
Right. Bye.
We're